Hi everyone, this is Kurt with Hypnodyne, and today I would like to give you the first preview of the Hypnodyne Auto Scorer. I've got three different recordings here in front of me. These are for the past few nights, and it's my EEG. September 20th, 22nd, and 23rd, because on the 21st I forgot to push store, so I went to bed with Zmax and it didn't record anything. That's better learn how to use my own software here. But I haven't really looked at these scorings in detail before, so this is a true snapshot of how the algorithm currently functions. There's a lot to say about how it's working, so slowly as I make my way through, I hope to remember all the relevant information. But as you know, this yellow line is just a light. In fact, you can see here towards the morning, towards 8:30, we got a full light, and this is the light off period. Lights on. Let's see, the second night, probably this is some restroom break, and then on the third night, nothing special to see here. Again, at around 8:30 it became really bright. Here I've got 6 sleep cycles, and I felt pretty good today when I woke up. The previous night I only had 4.5 sleep cycles. I felt not so good, and the first night I don't really recall, but there's one that got interrupted a little bit. Let's call that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sleep cycles. So it seems as if I need 6 sleep cycles for proper rest, which is what? It's 2.5 to 11. Yeah, 9 hours, as I've always known. I need 9 hours sleep. What a waste of time. Anyway, so as you know, there's two ways to look at the spectrogram. We go to the X-ray because it highlights things much better. The first thing that I look at when I want to figure out if the scoring was correct is the sleep onset. This is an initial chunk of alpha activity, which appears after a period of just settling down and walking around. You see a lot of movement, a lot of awake type, fast eye movements, probably reading. And then there's a gap here before the spindles begin. So actually this onset determination is perfect. This is exactly where I would have ended the alpha activity, that is wake. Here we have N1 in correspondence with slow eye movements. And then we go to N2, because even though they're a little bit too light to see, but the spindles actually begin here, even though they're pretty weak. You can confirm that by going into the features, and here you've got what I call the spindle envelope, which is simply this yellow wave here. This shows the spindle activity. So the onset determination was absolutely perfect, spot on. The next thing that I would check is N2 and N3. So what this is telling me is that up to this point, I'm in N2 sleep with a couple of interruptions, after which I go to N3 sleep. So what I want to see is scroll there and check what the waveform looks like, and then scroll here and make sure that there is a substantial difference. So now this is the first thing that I wanted to discuss, is the N2 versus N3 determination. The AASM rules for determining N3 sleep are based on voltage, amplitude, and time. There's a requirement for the delta waves to exceed the plus minus 75 microvolts level, which is marked here with these two horizontal lines, for at least 20% of the epoch. This kind of guideline is underspecified. That is, you cannot translate it into an algorithm. Let me give you some examples. Do you consider this bit right here to be in excess of 75 microvolts? Numerically, it is, because it's sticking out just a little bit, but it's sticking out so little that I think a human scorer would not count that. On the other hand, this is a clear exceeding of the threshold. You also have to keep in mind that at times there's sweat. This is not very evident on my recording. It seems I don't sweat that much, but there are people that sweat. And when you do sweat, what I notice that the sleep technicians do is to simply filter, filter, filter. Every time I complain, oh, look, there's sweat, they just suggest filter. But filtering doesn't work because the frequency range of sweat and delta waves is overlapping. So you can't just do that very easily. The other problem that I have with AASM rules is that there's no clear guideline as to what kind of electrode you should use to measure. If you measure at f4 versus f3 versus somewhere else, it would give you a different result. These delta wave amplitude changes. Not only does it change across the skull, but to a large extent, the amplitude depends on the distance from the electrode to the brain. So people that have a thick skull or they have thick tissue layers behind the skull and between the electrode and the brain, they're going to get lower delta magnitude. So the way I've done this is I departed a little bit from the AASM rules, and I've done this. I'm able to get a complete plot, which is not shown here, of the sleep depth. And then from that sleep depth, I calculate a threshold that is used to mark N2 versus N3, and that threshold is calculated according to the most likely phase change. So I am taking the level of intensity of sleep such that the patient spends the least possible amount of time around that level of intensity. And this is stated a little bit too algorithmically, I think, to make sense to a lot of people, but that just gives you a threshold that's dependent on the recording, and that says up to this point we're spending a significant amount of time. In this other state we're spending a significant amount of time, and in between there's very little time, which means that that is a state that's unstable, and it represents the sleep intensity that's sort of in the middle, and because it occurs so infrequently, it means that there's a state change that takes the brain state through that. And so what this type of method gives you is the most biologically plausible segmentation between N2 and N3. If it has to have any significance, you should mark the N2 and N3 point at the most likely phase change point. This is still not optimal, and it's only something I'm doing to keep with AASM rules, because this is fiction, you know, that the fact that there's going to be an N2 state and N3 state. There's a continuum that I don't have here open right now, but I can show you in another video. There's a continuum of sleep depth between N1 and N3. And so you can imagine that this staircase graph, this sudden, in fact, here I can show you, N2, N3. They don't look that different because they're not that different. Here we're in a transitional phase. This should be a smooth line here. Definitely this blocky transition between N2 and N3 is artificial. But as long as we're going to have it, I think I'm using the most biologically plausible way of determining this. And I think it's going to correlate very well in the majority of subjects with what a human scorer does. I think even though the human scorer is allegedly following AASM guidelines, I think there's a very strong tendency visually to do just what I've explained right now. That is to look through the epochs and then say, hey, you know, I think it's getting much more intense right here, so this is what I'm going to use as my threshold for N3. Now, the other thing that I would like to check is, for example, I'm moving towards a period that is guaranteed to be truly N3, and that's usually around the center of the first sleep cycle, and I look at what the wave looks like, and then I recede to something that's guaranteed to be N2, which is the very beginning of the first sleep cycle, and I ask myself, do they look very different? And yes, they do look very different, so that's validated. Then the next thing I do is go to the transition phase, that is when N2 turns into N3, and see if there's a difference here. And yes, I do see some substantial difference between before and after. Hope you can see it as well. So here's how I validate that transition between N2 and N3 got picked up correctly. Then if you want to be even more certain, you can move to other sleep cycles. For example, it's interesting here that in the second sleep cycle, when the sleep pressure should still be significant, I spent actually half of the cycle still in N2 sleep. So that might be mistaken, but I moved to it, and in fact I find that the signal is very flat, and I have K complexes and it's kind of flat, so that does make sense to score that as N2. However, here it goes into N3, so I want to check that that step is justified, and yes, I do see a lot more low frequency activity here than here. Perhaps not as big a difference as here to here, but that's to be expected as the night moves on. Then you can do the same exact thing right here, because, for example, to me it looks suspicious that I was still in N2 sleep on the third sleep cycle. Yeah, this looks like quite a bit different from right here, maybe, well, here for sure. So a lot of scorers go epoch by epoch. In fact, I think you're supposed to do that. And for each epoch, they see, am I above the threshold? Is it 20% of the epoch? Very difficult to apply the kind of guideline in a scientifically accurate way, because it's just too subjective. But what I've done here is to remember I was telling you about the intensity of the slow wave sleep and how the barrier between N2 and N3 is artificial. I am actually smoothing that out a little bit. I'm not interested in seeing very many transitions from N2, N3, N2, N3, and stuff like that, because I know that's not going to be biologically very significant. In fact, on the other hand, by smoothing it, I think it gives you a lot more information, because what you can see is, well, exactly what you would want to ideally see, which is, the sleep here. Yeah, I did get to N3 in the first 4 cycles, but I did spend a considerable portion of these cycles, namely the first half of each, in N2 sleep. And I don't care to see the N2, N3 thing go back and forth very much. I'm much more interested in knowing that this general area was deep and this other previous to that general area was less deep. Okay, so these are small departures that I'm making from ASM. For validation purposes, I'm still waiting for scored files so that I can sorry, there's always no way to shut down every single device that can potentially blink and beep. But what I was saying is that I'm still waiting to see if this is the way I want to do it, but this is the way that it's working for now. It's trivial for me to just judge each epoch based on its own sleep depth, but I think this way is more repeatable, is what I'm trying to say. If you look throughout similar records for the same participant or across participants, if you do it like this, it's more repeatable whether an epoch gets judged N2 or N3. It depends less on the particular, let's say, distribution of features within an epoch. Anyway, I think I spent enough time on that. The next thing that I would like to do to wrap up this validation of N2 versus N3, let me try to be very, very precise here. Towards the end of the night, I was not expecting to see N3 sleep, so I would judge this small gap to be a little bit suspicious. Perhaps it picked up some sweating or something like that, so I would go to it and examine it and see, yeah, actually that does look like N3 compared to, for example, this is guaranteed to be N2. This is something that's for sure N2. Here we got some kind of artifact. To check out what that is, I turn on and off the filtering. You know what? I don't know what that is. I can jump to the short Fourier transform to see what that is. That looks like, I don't know, either electrical interference or something like that. So that's not biological in nature. We don't have to care about that. But yeah, to be completely sure about this small gap, I go here. This is telling me that it's 3. I verify it against the guaranteed 3. I go back to that. They look very similar. Then I go to a guaranteed 2, which is a little bit earlier. It looks much flatter. So I'm going to say that I trust this. This probably did a correct job. Now, this is a place where, in spite of the smoothing, it's still kind of going back and forth. So this tells you that this is really somewhat in between N2 and N3, which is exactly what I see visually. Whereas here it's absolutely N2. All right, I think I've done enough validation on this recording of the N2 versus N3. The next thing you can do is take another record from the same subject and check out what N3 looks like here. And to get the display to work exactly the same way, I go back to X-ray on this recording as well. So I go back and forth between this and that, and I'm able to verify that, yeah, N3 looks the same from one recording to the next. What about N2? If I move towards about the same time into recordings, yeah, maybe I see a little bit more K complexes here, but that's statistically to be expected. It's not going to be identical, but yeah, look, looks very similar. Another couple of examples of what I was doing before, that is looking at N3, verifying that, yeah, it's kind of full of low frequency activity, and then going to an N2 phase and verifying that it's flatter. That works out. It works out here on this cycle as well. Even though I think these are heart rate interferences, you see that by removing the X-ray and going to the spectrogram. No, I don't see any horizontal lines in the spectrogram, which tells me that that is actually not that. Also, you can use the PPG and verify the peaks and troughs, and see I've got 4 heartbeats in this range, whereas I only have 2 oscillations over here. So this is something that looked to me as if it was some kind of heart rate interference, and it turned out to be not that. So that's fine, that I'm able to verify the same thing both from the PPG and looking at the spectrogram. Okay, I think I've said enough about the slow wave sleep. 2 things I would like to point your attention to is that this thing right here, this small thing, that's an alpha, which means that there was an awakening, and another one is going on right here, and it's normally very tough to catch these, but the algorithm did a wonderful job here because it marked these things as wake. If we go into the specifics, I think it probably marked this epoch as wake because of the movement, but then it extended it because of this alpha waves right here, which we can see in the transients. You will forgive me for the lack of axes both here and here, but they're going to be added soon, but it's quite trivial. So this transients right here represent the alpha waves that are going on. We have a transition between movement, and then we have alpha waves, and then we have slow eye movements. By the way, you can also see in the epoch the presence of eye movements, which would be these things here in beige color. You will see slow eye movements here as well. So to verify that, we move over here, and we see that indeed we have slow eye movements. Okay, so but the bottom line is that we were able to catch both this awakening and this awakening on the hypnogram very accurately, and that's great. Now we have here a period of confusion. Why do I say confusion? You see how choppy this alpha activity is. This is a period in which sleep is really not that stable at all. So for example, here we got an eye movement, but we also have spindles, which is why it got characterized as N2. Moving on, we have REM sleep. I'm looking for evidence that it's REM sleep. Gonna have to turn down the brightness here. I can't see the spectrogram. I'm not even sure that this is REM sleep. I mean, you could call these K complexes, but on the other hand, I see that this is an eye movement, and this could be a up and down eye movement. The left and right eye movement look like this, and the up down eye movements, they look like this. It seems too fat and short to be a K complex. This is very probably up and down eye movement, so it's probably correct that this is REM. If I'm not sure, I don't expect any algorithm to also be sure. Anyway, then we got N2. This looks like a genuine K complex. And then here we got wake simply because of the movement. Now there's one thing that I'd like to state is that on the AASM guidelines, they score wake when there's a major body movement accompanied by alpha waves. A major body movement without alpha waves is still considered as whatever epoch came before it, unless there's a wake epoch near it. Very convoluted rules, not really biologically substantiated, kind of like just a convention. One of the things I can do better than regular EEGs, having an accelerometer on board of Zmax, is figure out where the actual movement occurred. So you normally see movement on the EEG because the sensor is going to disarray, but I can do a much more precise job with an accelerometer. So what I've done now is to adopt some kind of compromise between pointing out all the movements on one side and having some type of AASM compatible system on the other. And what I've done is to simply remove all of the movements that are less than 5 seconds and then threshold the rest. And what this leads to is having things like this scored as wake, which might not in principle have been scored as wake on AASM. However, I think it's very handy because here the patient is moving around. It's moving around considerably. They're also changing position because you see that these three green lines are representing X, Y, and Z. They cross. They end up in a different position than they started. So there's a change in movement. Oh, silly me, I've got the head here. So do you see that there's a change in head position as I move back? Okay, so here they're sleeping with their head on the right side, and here they move, well, I move with my head towards the top. So that, and plus I do have a little bit of alpha waves, but I can't count on that algorithmically for every single person because simply some people are not frontal alpha producers, and so I wouldn't catch that. But this definitely is an awakening for me. Then we've got N1, makes sense. We don't have any significant features to base anything on right there. And then we have some spindles here. Then we have K complexes, so it's N2. Then it goes back to N1. This is interesting because there's sometimes cases in which there are eye movements, but they're so mild that the algorithm doesn't catch them. And if you force it to catch them, then it's going to be very subject to false positives. So I'd rather not. But yeah, I do kind of see the evidence of slow rolling eye movements. There are K complexes which could indicate arousal as opposed to be characteristic of N2 sleep. So I think that's fine. And here we go back into N2 sleep. So this transition that involves several types of epochs, where sleep is not even stable, looks to me to be entirely plausible based on what I see. And that's a great, a reassuring factor in my opinion. This is a major body movement. It's scored as wake, and you go back to N2. And then you have another major body movement with alpha waves, I see from the spectrogram up here, which I think is visible over here in the short time Fourier transform. Anyway, let's get past this phase, just making sure that we don't have any N3 activity because it's all being scored as N2. The threshold is put right here. Here is when the algorithm thinks that we're going into N3. Now, is this precise, accurate to ASM rules? No, I'm not using that ASM threshold because it's going to be inaccurate most of the time. So as long as there's a little bit of sweating, there might be a little bit of sweating right here, which brings this thing over the edge. I don't want to rely on that. It's too non-deterministic. But the idea is not that this particular descent on the hypnogram has to be in the exact perfect epoch. The important thing is you move 5-6 epochs to the left and it's got to look like N2, and then you move 5-6 epochs to the right and it's got to look like N3. And remember that this could be a very slow descent. In the first cycle you have a very fast descent based on my research from N2 activity to N3. That is, the delta waves kick in really fast in a way where you can definitely tell where the threshold is at. From the second sleep cycle onwards, that appearance of delta waves is much more fluid and mild, so you don't expect to see such a threshold on the second sleep cycle, much less the third. You expect the transition to be much more gradual. One thing that interests me is to go and see this REM period right here, see if I can find evidences for evidence of eye movements, which I can find a little bit here and here as well. Good thing that they got caught because they're very mild, and here definite evidence. And now when the eye movements are really, really strong, you should see them in orange in this wave right here. Then what I would want to see is this gap, analyze this gap, which, yeah, okay, that's not REM. Wake, REM here as well. Okay, so this, I would say pass. If we want to be very precise, there's a gap here in the spindles, but then there's K complexes in between, so that's fine that this is a straight N2 line right there. Another awakening right here, which was caught on the hypnogram. Another awakening with a lot of alpha waves. Let's visualize them right here. A lot of alpha right here. Okay, so all of this is very, very accurate. Then what I would want to see is why there are these interruptions in the middle of REM. There's some wake. Let's see what that's about. It seems to me that here we got some electrode problems, because why is there that kind of a spike? I don't know what that kind of spike is, so it might have been thrown off by that. But here there is a movement, so that would be fine. And then we're back in REM, very strong evidence of REM. Remember that you can go and look at the orange stuff. Then what have we got here? Okay, this is an epoch that got misscored. So this is, instead of being wake, this should definitely be REM. I'm not sure why it got classified as wake, but I would change that and make it REM. Okay, so we got two epochs that I manually changed. As for this, well, we start with REM, but then there's a huge body movement, so for now I'm calling that wake, so that's all fine. Moving into here, we have N1 sleep. Slow rolling eye movements, yes, accurate, perfect. There is a chance that some scorers might still call this REM. Honestly, I don't know. Then there's wake, and then we begin again with the sleep cycle. Let's see if there are any other important features that I want to take a look at. So the way I'm scoring wake, as I was saying before, it's prone to showing all kinds of wake peaks on the hypnogram. Now that's a preference. I'm still waiting for feedback as to whether people want this or don't want this, but to me, to have big movements marked as wake makes a lot of sense, because I want to see how many of them I had. For example, I had a lot of such movements and awakenings throughout the night compared to other people, and that's some salient information, so I don't know why you would ignore them. So this is basically a bunch of REM epochs with some wake periods in between when there are twitches, body movements, and all of that. If I want to be really, really precise with it, I think I would probably remove some of the epochs that got marked as wake. For example, here, I don't know, I would say this is still REM. I would bypass that wake thing. It's perhaps a little bit too sensitive. And here there's a body movement, but the epoch begins with REM, so that's really a little bit too high detail for what the auto scoring does. Basically, if there's a big movement in the epoch, I call it wake. I would say a little bit more than half of the epoch is REM, but these things don't affect your results, so it really doesn't matter. If you output the sleep report in the end, this is not going to affect the metrics of your sleep or the sleep efficiency or the various breakdowns by much at all. Something I'd be a little bit more curious is to go into this chunk that got marked as N1 and figure out if it really is N1, or if some eye movements got missed by the algorithm, which in fact is the case here. So I would set this one and this one as REM as well. But these are minute details, you see. I changed 4 epochs up to this point. And this might actually be N1. I don't see any evidence of anything. And there's wake. Wake is happening because of strong alpha activity, which you can see here. There's also a slow rolling eye movements. So period of drowsiness. So this is definitely not REM sleep. And then there's the actual awakening. Then we go back to N2. Okay, so it's basically perfect. It's basically perfect. Here I actually woke up, I think, and there are a couple of epochs here that should be wiped out and set to alpha. So I changed 6 epochs out of 1,000. Oops, no, I think that I clicked the wrong button. I changed 6 epochs out of 1,026. I would call that a pretty good result. Unless I can't score, then that's another thing. Interesting things here. We can disable the hypnogram for a bit and change to the heart rate. Now the heart rate is going to be valid only when the patient is not moving, because we're calculating it using PPG. So if you look at the quality of PPG right here, it's borderline. Here it's very good. So you can see the wave very, very nicely shaped. If you take any one of these spikes, so like here, for example, here, I think I'm moving around and probably restroom break or something like that. So yeah, the whole signal is in disarray, so you would ignore this peak right here. I think with a little bit more effort, you could even mark where the wave is not accurate. But since I'm not using the heart rate for any further processing, I haven't really gone far with developing that as well. It's easy. I mean, you got to take just scroll through the signal and look at the correlation between each individual peak. Here would be extremely high, and here would be near zero. So that would tell you if it's accurate or not. But one thing that people say about these wristwatches that claim to stage your sleep is, at least they can see when you're in REM phase because what? You got higher heart rate, or you got more heart rate variability. Let me tell you something. The only reason you have higher heart rate variability in REM is you have more moving around. And so yeah, these peaks here, you see a lot of peaks right here. You see a few peaks right here, but still happening a lot. They're the reason why you see so much heart rate variability to a large extent. There are places like here, for example, this range right here where I'm in deep sleep, I'm in N3 sleep, and still have peaks. So, a sleep staging system based only on accelerometry, based only on PPG, like some of these watches, may think that this is REM, whereas in fact it's N3. Having all of these sensors together really allows you to look at the correlation between accelerometric data and the true sleep stages, or PPG data and the true sleep stages, and you realize quickly that the only real way to stage sleep is with electroencephalography. There's no way you get anything near accurate result using anything other than that. You can use these signals to add to the accuracy of EEG. For example, if you have accelerometry that tells you that the patient is moving a lot, then you know that whatever you're seeing above on the EEG is garbage. So you wouldn't think that this is delta waves or anything like that, because you know the patient is moving. But to have only this and not this, that's just not going to work. If you want to see also something interesting, the hypnogram superimposed with the head position. So what I want to see is whether the head position has anything to do with my sleep quality. And again, sorry, this doesn't really have any labels, but you just scroll to here and you look at the head, and now you know that this levels means I'm sleeping with my face to the right. Okay, so back to hypnogram. Does sleeping with my face on the right side help? Maybe, because look, here I was sleeping with my face pointing to the left, and I stayed in N2 sleep for quite some time. Then I turned right, and pretty soon I was in N3 sleep. How about here? Here I'm also to the left, and in fact my N3 sleep got delayed by a whole lot. This proves it though, because here you can't really draw inferences of this magnitude just looking at one recording, but the idea is you take a lot of them, and at some point you would be able to figure out something like that, like your best head position for sleeping. Here I was facing with my head to the right, and it seems I got more N3 sleep, and I got into N3 sleep more quickly. I'm used to sleeping on the right side, by the way. All right, I think I've already recorded a lot here. It's probably exceeding most people's level of commitment to finish watching this. So let's see if I have anything else of interest. This patch of alpha sleep, sorry, not alpha sleep, but of alpha waves correctly got scored as what you may call it, as wake. You will notice that it's very hard to say that this is alpha. It's something I can see visually, but to get a machine to see it, it's very tough. Like for example, you can see that this alpha is occurring at the same level as theta, and theta and alpha look identical in width, in thickness. Not only that, but during REM, theta oscillates, so it's not very stable in frequency. It's much more stable during sleep cycles. Then again, during sleep cycles, the amount of theta is completely random. Like here it's mixed, coming and going. Here it's very strong. Here it's almost nothing. And so to realize that this is the right intensity and the right spot to consider it alpha, and to be able to do that on many subjects with different phenotypes, that's quite big. And I have to say my phenotype is not one of the easiest. It's easy for some things. For example, my alpha doesn't much overlap the spindle frequency, but for other things like I've articulated, it's hard because alpha and theta are different. I also want to direct your attention towards the fact that alpha that occurs during an awakening and the alpha that occurs prior to sleep, they look different. They might not even be the same type of brain process that generates them. I found that this is frequently the case regardless of the phenotype and the particular frequency at which alpha waves manifest themselves in a patient. But it does correspond to wake anyway, so they're correctly scored as wake. That's a big one. Like, for example, to know that, I don't know, where can I find that same kind of intensity, for example? I would have to move to a different record. Let's see if I find an example. Well, here's the same kind of intensity, and it's also alpha. Let me remove the head position because it's too much clutter. Let's also remove the light envelopes. It's useless here. So let's say, for example, if I wanted to find fault with this, I would move over here and say, hey, that alpha intensity is continuing, and yet you go down to an N1 sleep. But then the intensity is much decreased. It's decreased quite abruptly. And here I got a bunch of slow eye movements. So I have to say this scoring is really nice. It's looking really good. Is there anything else that's substantial here? I don't think so. Well, this is a first preview of the auto scoring function in Zmax, which, as you have seen, doesn't just yield a hypnogram, but it yields a bunch of information, including all the features. And if you're a sleep researcher and you're trying to do more precise quantitative analysis, you might not want to focus on the hypnogram itself. You might want to focus, for example, on the amount of slow eye movements, which you could get from this wave right here in beige. You might be interested in the correlation of the signal, or in the amount of movement, or in the amount of sweat. These are all things that you could operate directly on, even without resorting to a hypnogram, which is basically it's a reduction in dimensionality from these and many more features that are detected by Zmax, and then transformed into just a integer number from 1 to 5 with the sleep phases. So you have a lot more information here, and it's available in text format as well, so you can do whatever processing you like to do on it. I think we've done enough covering of these 3 recordings today. I would rate these scorings as extremely accurate. I haven't picked accurate recordings on purpose. This is generally the accuracy that I'm seeing on dozens and dozens of different participants. There are some particular phenotypes that are still problematic, but I'm keeping them for less because they're so rare. Like, there are some people that don't have sleep spindles at all visible on the EEG, and some where the spindles like completely fade throughout a sleep cycle. But one thing that I wanted to stress, just so I remember it before I finish, is that the way that a lot of people are approaching sleep staging is through the kind of AI algorithm that is very prone to overfitting. Because essentially, like, for example, take convolutional neural networks, they're sampling what they see in the epochs and then creating a classifier based on what they see on the epochs. The drawback to that is when you switch to a different data set, they fail miserably. And one of the peculiarities of the Hypnodyne algorithm is that even though I used a bunch of recordings to create the algorithm has not stored any knowledge that's particular to these phenotypes. It has stored knowledge that's particular to the phenotypes, but it hasn't stored any knowledge that's particular to these recordings. So that every recording that comes out of this, it hasn't seen them before. If I record a new night tomorrow, the scoring of that is not more likely to be accurate just because it already has 3, which is good because it means this is not just going to fail randomly when you give it new data. And that's where most of the papers that are published nowadays, they fail miserably. They say 85% accuracy on sleep staging, and then you change the data set, and all of a sudden a third, maybe half of your recordings are complete garbage. You will not get that with Hypnodyne. All right, that's all I've got to say for today. Thanks so much for having this much patience. I hope I haven't been too verbose, but we've looked at quite a bit of detail. If you have any questions, post them below or contact us, and I'd be glad to cover anything that might have been a little bit hard to understand this time around. Again, I haven't prepared this or anything. So thanks for watching.